Good afternoon. This is Mathew Steele with the new show called The Elephant in the Room for the New Covenant Group. And my guest today is Ozymandias Ramses II. And welcome to the show.
Thank you, Matthew.
The focus of the show, at least for today, will be the um, just for today, a few of the arguments that are going around in the atheist community that some people are arguing for, but I think Ozzy and I are both on the same page in terms of them not really being justified. And one of those being that all babies are atheists and similar arguments. So we're just going to sort of flow with that and see where it goes. But I think that one would be a good one to start with. So if you'd like to start, Ozzy, and give us a presentation of how the argument is usually delivered when someone agrees with it, and then we can start from there.
Sure. Okay. Well, first, let me thank you again for inviting me on the show. It's a bit of a privilege to be the first person on this show, so thank you again. Yeah, the argument about atheists or babies is sort of a kind of a byproduct, an implication of a definition of atheism that is sort of very widely subscribed in the online atheist community. It's not a definition of atheism that one hears sort of out in the larger world, or if you consult a dictionary or something like that. Not that dictionaries are the place to go for these sorts of things necessarily, but sort of people normally understand atheism to mean that it's someone who rejects theism, who believes that there are no gods. But within the atheist online community, it's common for people to say that no, atheism is more properly characterized as a lack of a belief in a God. It's the absence of a belief in a God. Now, construed very, very strictly, what that would mean is that anything or anyone, but not just anyone, even anything, that lacks a belief in a God is an atheist. So, babies, therefore, are born presumably not believing in a God. I think it's a safe bet, but it's not, who knows? But I think it's a fairly safe bet that babies don't have any opinions on these matters. And so they don't have a belief in God. They don't affirm or, internally believe that there's a God, presumably. But now some people are satisfied with that. They say, well, that's okay. That's just sort of an implication of the view that if atheism means a lack of belief in God, then it has to be the case that babies and children of a certain age, up until they hear about the concept and stuff like that, are just going to be atheists. Someone from another culture, it doesn't have to be a baby either. It could be someone from another culture, fully grown adult, who's never heard of the concept of God, for instance. That person, they would say, lacks a belief in God and so is an atheist. There are certain other unpalatable implications, though, like, well, it turns out that my dog and all my house pets and barnyard animals and my house plant, my furniture, the galaxy, interest rates, the economy, you name it, anything that you could name that doesn't have a belief in God lacks a belief in God and is therefore an atheist. So the galaxy is an atheist, and the rocks in my garden are an atheist, and my baby's an atheist, my dog's an atheist, and the cactus on my table over there is an atheist. So this is a problem in the minds of some people, but some people just bite the bullet on this and they say, no, that's all there is to being an atheist, and so that's the argument. Now, the reason this is usually said is because, well, I actually don't think there's a good reason for this. So I maybe I'm not the best person to articulate the reason for it.
Just to cut in quickly, I think the reason it's said is because it supports the argument that atheism is the default.
Yeah. I don't think that's so much an argument as it is a motivation. I think that is what motivates the argument, but I don't think that's a good reason. That is, I don't think that supports the case. That just sort of provides a person with motivation for wanting this definition and recommending this definition of atheism, but I don't think it's a good reason at all. I mean, first of all, The fact that something is a default position doesn't make it more likely to be true. I mean, if everyone was born believing in Bigfoot, but there was no evidence of Bigfoot, that would be a perfectly terrible reason to say the default position is that we believe in Bigfoot. So, if you doubt Bigfoot, it's up to you to prove there's no Bigfoot, because the default position is we're all born with Bigfoot. If someone were to do that, we would think, no, that's irrational. That it doesn't matter what your starting psychological state is here, whether you have a belief or lack a belief in something. That has nothing to do with where the burden of evidence lies. It has nothing to do with the truth, and it has nothing to do with the burden of evidence. But that's the idea, is that you want to say that there's a default position, and therefore it behooves the person who's not in the default position to explain why they believe what they believe. So if a theist comes along and says, I believe in God, they have a burden of evidence. Well, obviously they have a burden of evidence because they've made an assertion. And what people who believe in this particular definition of atheism want to say is, well, since we all start off not believing in a God, what needs explaining here is how anyone ever comes to have a belief in a God. And that anyone who comes to have a belief in God, they're going to have reasons for that. Otherwise, they never should have left the default position. And so the burden lies entirely on them. That's sort of the motivation. I don't think it's particularly good argument, though, for a few reasons. The first reason I said was that a default position isn't necessarily a true position, but there's a sort of a more important one here, and that is that no position is free of an evidentiary burden. We often speak of burden of proof, but really what we should do is speak of burden of evidence. Proof is a term that is properly used in certain restricted domains like logic and set theory and math and purely formal domains where you can actually do a formal proof. In the rest of the world, what we're always concerned with is evidence. You want sufficient reasons that rationally warrant a conclusion, but don't necessarily absolutely prove it. I can't absolutely prove that that's a house over there in the distance, right? I could be mistaken. There's, subject to errors and stuff like that. But, there's plenty of evidence for why I can see a house over there, or that there is a house over there that supports my belief that there's a house over there. So what we should do is speak of burden of evidence, strictly speaking, not burden of proof, except in restricted domains. So the question here then is, where does the burden of evidence lie when you make assertions like there is a God or there's no God or something like that?
Would you consider saying I believe there is a God to be equivalent to saying there is a God?
Yeah, of course, because to say that you believe there is a God is to say you believe the proposition there is a God.
But that only speaks to your belief, not to the truth of the objective truth of reality.
But
right?
when you say there is a God, all you are expressing is the belief that there is a God. Every proposition where you say this is a glass, this is a shirt, this is a human head, whenever you say something like that, you could just as easily preface it with, I believe this is a glass. I believe this is a shirt. I believe this is a human head. It's as if every assertion is essentially coming with and what's called assertoric force in speech act theory. It comes with the sort of packaged with belief. This is called a propositional attitude. I can believe that this is a glass, hope that this is a glass, fear that this is a glass, despise that this is a glass. There's all these attitudes to the proposition, this is a glass. And belief is one of them. And so whenever you just merely assert a fact about reality, you are, of course, trying to speak of reality, but it's just a statement of belief. Now, where people don't like this sometimes is because very often we want to fudge. We'll use the word belief to sort of qualify our confidence. We'll say, well, I believe that's the case. Really what we're trying to say is, well, I have kind of a weak, guarded belief about this. I'm not very confident. We'll kind of hedge our bets. We'll throw the word belief in there instead of simply saying this is a glass. I'll say, well, I believe this is a glass. Maybe it's just a sculpture of a glass, but not really.
And if people want to avoid the term belief altogether, they'll often say, I consider this a glass. I think this is a glass.
Yeah,
but
that's
really
right.
is just a matter of belief, because as you've explained and as I believe, we have a sort of a construct in our minds of how we view reality. It's something that we build actively and passively, and uh, that is always based on beliefs, whether they're justified by evidence or not. So that matrix of reality that's in your mind, anytime you explain that, you are talking about what you believe to be true. So that's a distinction that I think a lot of people who consider themselves to be rationally minded thinkers, they overlook when they talk about the way things are. They may not necessarily be separating themselves from what they're talking about. Their belief, that matrix, they may not be separating it from reality, showing that there is a filter between what they believe and what is actually true. Because all you can really do when it comes to the external world is say, this is how I perceive it, and does it match what you perceive as well? But in that sense, when we're getting into more, advanced concepts of philosophy than the layperson would ever engage in most cases. Um, a lot of atheists, I think, have a tendency to pull back from that. And I don't want to use the term scientism so much as um, irrational certainty that a lot of atheists have about their beliefs. Especially, I hear a lot of atheists say they know for a fact that there is no God and no gods. There can't be, that they're all made up. And I know we're getting away from the all babies are atheists and just sort of rambling on here, but I'll bring it back to that in a minute. But my point is that I don't see, and I hope you agree, I don't see there's any way at all that you could rule out the possibility of something that could be considered a god depending on how it's defined.
Well, yeah, depending on how it's defined. I mean, there would be ways of defining a God that would be incoherent. You could imagine a God that has mutually incompatible attributes, and so that being couldn't exist as
Right.
defined. But you could define it another way, and you can also define a being so vaguely that there'd be no way of telling. In which case, well, then maybe you can't rule it out because you can't get as far as figuring out what the concept refers to. It's vacuous. So, and then of course anyway, the point is whether or not you can prove or rule out something from existence depends on how well the concept is defined. And you can define something so tightly that you can absolutely rule it out, because you could say, hypothetically, God is something that exists in my living room and is visible, and is pink. And there's nothing, pink in this room, therefore God doesn't exist. I could rule that God out if that's what God were. Or God is, Zeus, and Zeus lives on Olympus, and he sits on a throne. He should be right here. You can go up there, and he's not there. Okay, well, he doesn't exist, not as defined. So depending on how you define things, that's going to determine whether or not you can conclusively rule something out. But to conclusively rule something out, I mean, strictly, logically speaking, to rule something out absolutely would mean you'd have to prove that it was an impossibility, not merely that you couldn't find it. And to prove that something's an impossibility, you'd have to establish that there's something contradictory about it, right? It would have to contradict some known fact, or it would have to be internally self-contradictory, inconsistent with itself. Then you could rule it out. So that would be the only way. But what you were saying about sort of, belief and reality, that we have to make sure that we understand sort of belief as sort of the map, and reality being the territory. And whenever you're talking about something on the map, you are in fact trying to refer to the territory. And of course, when your map is accurate, then your belief is true. When your map is inaccurate, your belief is false. And it can be more or less false depending on how close that mapping relationship is between the map and the territory. But yeah, I mean, it has to be said that you're not, whenever you just make an assertion, you are in fact just expressing your belief. Assuming you're expressing it sincerely. I mean, I can make an assertion hypothetically where I don't believe something, I can say, let's pretend that such and such, or for the sake of argument, the Batmobile is in my garage. Well, I don't believe the Batmobile is in my garage, but I can assert that the Batmobile is in my garage for the sake of argument. That's not a sincere assertion. It's a hypothetical assertion. But when you assert something sincerely, then you are asserting something. You are expressing a belief. And to express a belief is not to express a belief with an absolute degree of confidence, because beliefs admit of degrees of confidence. I have some beliefs about which I'm very confident. I have beliefs about which I'm much more guarded. And I have beliefs about which I'm just like really on the fence. I don't know. I could very easily be talked out of them. So when you say that you believe something, weakly, we often have a tendency to throw in words like I consider, or it's my opinion, or I guess I believe this, And then there are other times when you feel very strongly, then you kind of tend to want to drop the word belief on. You want to sort of emphasize it, and you'll say things like, it is the case that the Batmobile is in my garage. Or I might say something like, I know. We use the word know very often as an honorific term, as a way of sort of expressing our conviction in our belief. So, I mean, there's different ways of expressing belief, but when you express or assert a proposition sincerely, you are expressing a belief, and you are making an assertion about reality. So if you say there's no God, you're not necessarily saying you can prove there's no God. I mean, I say there's no God all the time. I'm an atheist. In my view, that's what it means to be an atheist. It is to affirm that there is no God. It is to deny the proposition that there is a God. It is to deny theism. Atheism is the denial of atheism. It's not to say that I know and conclusively establish that there's no God, and no more than I can do that for unicorns and Bigfoot, right? It's just I have reasons why I think that there is no God. And when you assert something, whether it's positive or negative, you incur a burden of evidence. And this is one of the sort of the biggest confusions that goes on in this discourse between theists and atheists, and atheists are the most guilty of this, unfortunately, is this mistaken assumption that that the person with the positive assertion, who makes the positive claim, has the burden of proof, and the person who makes a negative claim has no burden of proof. That's incorrect. That if you take a course in logic or critical thinking, you'll find that that's actually incorrect. Whoever makes an assertion, whatever the assertion is, positive or negative, that person, when they make the assertion, they have a burden of evidence. But not all burden of evidences are going to be the same. Some are harder than others. When you say there's a God, that's a pretty tall burden of evidence. When I say there's no God, burden of evidence is a lot lighter. If I say there's Bigfoot, burden of evidence is hard. I got to produce some evidence, some material evidence of Bigfoot. If I say there's no Bigfoot, all I've got to do is show that evidence that we ought to find of Bigfoot is not there to be found. There we go.
My only problem with your definition of what atheism means is that to believe there is no God, that sets a definition for what God is. It hasn't been established. To say there is no God would mean that God itself has already been defined somewhere.
Yeah, no, that's true of anything, though. The same thing with Bigfoot.
Right.
So if I say there's no Bigfoot, it presumes a working or provisional tentative definition of Bigfoot. So if I say there's no God, I'm saying that in a particular context. The context of utterance is going to determine what God we're talking about. If I'm talking to a Muslim who says, do you believe in God? And I'll say, no.
What if you're not talking to anyone, though? What if you're just stating outright there is no God? So there's no context.
Well, then what I can only mean is that the way God is commonly used in ordinary discourse across as many individuals as possible, so if I say there's no God, if I just sort of like type in a chat room or something, I'm an atheist, I think there's no God, to no particular person, then really what I'm trying to say is, look, any and all gods I've ever heard of or that anybody can think of, that God doesn't exist, right? So it could be the deistic God, a pantheistic God, a panentheist God, the God of the monotheisms, of polytheistic gods, all kinds of gods. I'm denying all of those. Those don't exist. You can do that, but it's understood that in that very unrestricted context of utterance, I'm referring presumably to any and all gods that have ever been put on offer. That's a harder argument to make. That is a much bigger burden of evidence there to it's harder to argue against deism, for instance, than to argue against Zeus.
I'm disagreeing with you in the the way that you're clarifying what God means when you say that you believe there is no God. Because if you're talking just about the gods that everyone knows, that's the ones that are relevant. Like if you say the word God to a Christian, they're going to have one concept. Say it to a Hindu, they're going to have a different concept. So you take all of those concepts that have ever been posited in human history, that still doesn't speak to other possibilities that we don't know about. So in my understanding of God, the term God, it in the more advanced sort of theological understanding that's used in the professional apologetic arguments or the logical arguments that they make to try to establish that a God exists, they're doing their best to keep it as close to an unfalsifiable deistic God as possible. Mm-hmm. And that is going to carry with it the baggage of attributes that we are not privy to. So if that is the God that's going to be what we have to argue against in the future, in my opinion, we have to be prepared to include not just unfalsifiable, but unknowns in the concept, in the definition of what God means. So if we only speak about like Yahweh or Zeus, that's fine because they were gods, but that's not the gods that theologians are now arguing for. No, there aren't any theologians that as far as I know, that are arguing for a literal interpretation of the Bible or the Quran, and they're not being taken seriously.
There in fact are.
But they're not being taken seriously by the community if they are, I would imagine.
Well, within certain communities they are. I mean,
okay, but not in philosophical circles in general. It's not something that's generally supportable. It's a faith-based claim, but the ones that are bringing the logical arguments, trying to make them to establish God, they're the ones that we're going to have to deal with in the future. They're the ones that we're going to have to talk to and be prepared to argue against in the future. And in that case, to define God as previous gods is, I think, setting ourselves up for failure.
Well, that might be true. I mean, you've got people who sort of have very, very nebulous conceptions of God, very, very rarefied gods. God is the ground of all being, or something like that. It gets really, really, some of these theologians have, are sort of arguing for a God, that have parishes of one person in them. The person making the claim. So I don't know how much
sorry to interrupt you, but that is sort of what is happening to Christianity, though. Ever since the Protestant Reformation, the individual understanding of the monotheistic God, that's sort of where the idea is going, right? Mm-hmm. So what you're saying is the parish of one. I mean, that's kind of what the Protestant Reformation is leading Christians toward.
Yeah, but I mean, I don't think that presents a particular problem for the position that I was advocating, and I don't think it's particularly problematic for an atheist who wants to argue against, for atheism, against the conception that there are any gods at all. I mean, obviously, sort of the more the definition of God in question impinges upon reality and has implications about what we ought to expect to find, the easier it is to point, well, I'm not finding the evidence that I ought to be finding, but if the conception of God gets more rarefied and obscure, then of course it can verge and eventually become completely unfalsifiable. But there's an argument to be made against unfalsifiable things, and in other words, you don't have to prove that something can't exist to say no belief in this is warranted. Remember, the burden, it's not burden of proof, right? It's burden of evidence. The burden of evidence simply is, what evidence do you need to either affirm or deny the existence of something? I don't have to prove that Bigfoot doesn't exist to deny that Bigfoot exists. I don't have to sort of scour every forest simultaneously, all the woods of Canada, and have eyes everywhere at all times, and then prove at, bang, at this particular moment we surveyed every square inch from coast to coast, and we discovered there's no Bigfoot. There, finally, we can say there's no Bigfoot. We don't have to do anything like that. You just have to show that where you would expect there to be Bigfoot, we don't find Bigfoot. And if it turns out that Bigfoot has powers that make him indiscernible and undetectable, okay, then now there's a problem. Now the problem is, well, wait a minute. Now you have robbed yourself as a believer in Bigfoot of any reason why you should believe in Bigfoot, right? And this is one of the things that sort of goes on in sort of theistic discourse, where they posit a God that is very rarefied and esoteric, and a parish of one. They end up positing a God which they themselves don't have any good reason to think exists. So there is a burden of evidence on either side. If I say that, if they say that there's a burden, if they say that there's a God, they incur a burden of evidence. I think it's a fairly heavy burden of evidence. But I can say, well, I have a burden of evidence too when I deny it, but my burden of evidence is a lot lighter. That is, I just have to show that the evidence is lacking that would warrant a belief in this being. And if it turns out that there couldn't be evidence one way or the other, well, why would anyone believe it, right? And you might say, well, why wouldn't no one deny it? But there's no grounds for a belief at all,
right?
If that's the case, then I don't need to change. I don't need to adopt a belief. I can still say I don't think that thing exists.
Well, to take the Christian, the devil's advocate position for a Christian, they argue that there's something called spiritual knowledge, which wouldn't be limited by rationality. So if that is their standard for what's true or not, there's not really any way to speak to that. And again, I think that with the parish of one and the theological arguments that are being made, and since so much of belief is being justified based on personal experience, you end up basically having the entire theological map, as you put it, for a believer being off limits to any sort of comprehension by someone else. So in that sense, I argue strongly that when you are discussing with a believer about what is and is not true, that you have to only do your very best to address the claims they're making in that discussion, and try not to bring up any other definitions of gods. And if they're not a literal, like a fundamentalist Christian who believes in a literal interpretation of their Bible, then there's no point in bringing that up, because saddling someone with the mistakes, the disproved arguments that other people have used is just going to bog you down. So, to bring this back to are all babies atheists? I disagree. Even though I understand the context of the argument that's being made, I disagree on the grounds that I consider atheism to be a response to theism, because the term itself would not exist if it weren't for theism. So there's no point in using the term atheist unless there is a theism that you're responding to, a theist argument that you're responding to. But I understand the context that they use it. It's that an atheist is like a baby boy that's born is technically a bachelor, right? He's a bachelor because he's not married. But it has no context. A baby wouldn't be married, right? So technically, yes, the baby is a bachelor because he's not married yet. But why would you even use that term to describe him? I mean, it's like calling a baby girl a spinster because she's never been married, and it loses all context. There's no point in making the argument that all babies are atheists. It would be much better to speak to what they do and don't know in terms of knowledge, because I think that the reason, and I'm just going on my belief here, my map, as you put it, our understanding of reality ends up leading us to questions to ask that I think gave rise to religion. There are questions that we aren't able to answer. one of which being why the universe appears to be finely tuned. Just things like this. Why are we here? Why is there something rather than nothing? All of these questions, they're either nonsensical or they would involve us knowing something that we don't currently. That doesn't mean we won't someday, but right now we don't. So to grow up and learn about the world around you, you are most likely going to come against those walls of questions that you can't answer. So how you end up answering them is based on what else you know. So it's really, I think, more, if you want to argue babies are atheists, then do it from the direction of what babies do and don't know, as opposed to what they believe. Because saying a baby believes that God exists or doesn't believe that God exists is nonsense. There's no point in saying that, because it's like saying the baby's not married. It's silly. Unless you're talking about some culture where they actually marry babies to each other. So
Yeah, I don't like the analogy that's made with, a baby boy as a bachelor, because it's unmarried. And that's because bachelorhood is defined as a condition of whether or not you're married or not. But theism, atheism is understood to be an opinion. This is sort of the weird thing. Does it make sense to say that this chair is a non-omnivore? Well, I guess. I mean, it doesn't eat anything. It's certainly a non-carnivore. It's a non-herbivore. It's a non-omnivore. It doesn't eat anything. But the reason it sounds queer to say that is because we know that furniture doesn't eat things. That's why it doesn't make sense to describe this chair or other inanimate objects as non-carnivores. We say that something is an herbivore or a carnivore or not a carnivore or not an herbivore or something like that within a certain class of entities where that term makes sense. And when we speak of theism and atheism, we're talking about beings that can opine, that can have beliefs, that can render a verdict, can reach a judgment or a conclusion on a certain question. And babies can't even conceive of God, presumably, and so cannot opine on the question one way or the other. So here's the way I think of this. What a lot of people are calling atheism, by defining it a lack of belief in God, that's not atheism. That's what I call lacktheism. They lack theism. That's lacktheism. This is a lacktheist. Okay? I'm a lacktheist. I also lack a belief in God. But I don't just lack a belief in God. I also think, damn it, there's no God. Okay? That's what makes me a lacktheist, is that I'm an atheist. I'm a lacktheist because I'm an atheist. This is a lacktheist because it can't even have an opinion. And it's the same thing with babies. So this is a confusion. And see, the proposition God doesn't exist is an assertion. The proposition theism is false is an assertion. The proposition there's no evidence for the existence of a God is an assertion. These are all assertions, okay? And Christopher Hitchens had a famous line that it's often repeated in this community, which is, that which is asserted without evidence can be dismissed without evidence.
I love that.
Yeah, it's a great quote. Well, these were all assertions I just made. God doesn't exist. There's no God. Theism is false. There is no evidence for the existence of a God. Those are all assertions. Well, if you're going to assert those things and you don't want a theist to just go, ding, I dismiss those because you asserted them without evidence, then you better have some kind of argument for those assertions. It's a condition of public assertability that your claims need to be supported with either evidence or arguments if you want to be taken seriously. And that's as true if you're a theist, if you're an atheist, as if you're a theist. The burden of evidence for an atheist, I think, is so light, that I don't think that we need to sweat this. But I think what motivates this whole lacktheism argument as a definition of atheism is a desire to sort of camouflage yourself. I'm going to hide amongst the lacktheists in the world. Okay, I'm going to hide among all the things that can't even have an opinion here, because those things, of course, don't assert anything. This glass of single malt whiskey cannot assert that there's a God or no God.
I see
And
where you're coming from.
well, I just want to finish the point.
Yeah,
Because it can't assert anything, it can't incur a burden of evidence, right?
right.
And if I can define my atheism in terms of the same lacktheism that this has, then I can avoid the burden of evidence. But I think that doesn't fool anybody on the other side. Everybody on the other side is saying, look, everybody knows that an atheist is someone that thinks there's no God. It's not someone who merely lacks. I'm not missing a belief on the issue of God's existence. Darn it, I have a belief on the issue of God's existence. It's that there isn't a God that exists. That's what atheism is.
I
You know,
I disagree with you in that um, if like I said, the way I was explaining it, if you in your life you develop to the point where you come to these questions that you can't answer, then the default should be, okay, well, I can't answer these questions using any rational means that I can think of, right? But if someone says, well, oh, I can't answer it for you, and then your response after hearing their answer is, well, that doesn't make any sense to me. I'm not going to believe that that's true.
mm-hmm.
Then when you apply that to God claims, that to me is what atheism means. It's not that you are saying, God, that doesn't exist or you're wrong. I'm saying that you are incorrect. I'm saying that
At the moment you say
you
a
have
person
not
is,
convinced me that you're correct.
which is to say that you think the other person is incorrect, which is an
No,
assertion.
I don't think, I mean, I might be making a logical error of some kind here,
You
but
are, you are.
the,
This is a logical error. There is no difference between saying, I don't believe this proposition, if by don't believe you mean I think it's false. If you think the proposition is false, that's a proposition, right?
but
If you
you
think
don't
theism is,
necessarily, it's not,
yeah,
I mean, you don't have to think something is false to be not convinced that it's true. You could eventually be convinced that it's true. You could
right?
be,
No, that's fine. But that's just to say that you're on the fence now,
right.
right? Right. That's what we call a species of agnosticism. The people who've defined atheism in terms of what I call lacktheism, what they have done is they have said, the people who can't make up their mind, I declare them to be atheists. Why? They lack a belief in God. Wait a minute. You've just taken people who have just made the decision that they don't want to be called atheists because they really cannot make up their mind, or they think the question is undecidable. And you've just subsumed them under the heading of atheism. Very often against their will and their express insistence otherwise. No, don't call me an atheist. I'm not a. Most agnostics out there will tell you, no, I'm not some species of atheist. But within the atheistic community, it is sort of practically a truism now to say that atheism is the mere lack of belief in God. Therefore, an agnostic who doesn't have a belief in God, by definition, is an atheist. This is another one of the motivations operative here is let's try to evacuate as many people out of one camp and import them into the camp of atheism. And this move gets run the other way by theists. They try to define theism so narrowly as they try to define atheism so narrowly as atheism is someone who believes that you can absolutely prove that there's no God.
Right.
And they evacuate everyone out from under the heading of atheism. People like me who thinks, no, there's no God, and because I don't think there's any darn good reason to think there's a God.
Okay, so we're kicking around this term belief an awful lot, and
Sure.
that was one of the questions in the comment section that I meant to get to. Is I believe it was Helena Handbasket asked, can you clarify the difference between belief and knowledge? And I'm going to also throw in on my own end, I'm going to throw in faith as well. Can you clarify for everybody who's watching the difference between faith, belief, and knowledge?
Okay, well, a belief is simply what you think is the case. Whatever you think is the case, that's your belief.
No matter how it's justified, that's something you've accepted
That's right.
to be true.
That's right. You can have beliefs that are completely unjustified, pure blind faith, completely irrational, if you will. You can have beliefs that are very, very superbly justified, but those are all species of belief. And you can believe things with great confidence or less confidence. It's just, a belief is just your opinion on the matter, what you think is the case, to whatever degree of confidence, however well or poorly justified. That's what a belief is. It's what we call a propositional attitude. It's an attitude towards a proposition, to be distinguished from things like, I believe that this glass is almost empty. I fear that the glass is almost empty. I hope that the glass is almost empty, and on and on. These are all different propositional attitudes. Now,
Right.
with respect to knowledge, knowledge is it was a complicated question, but there's a branch of philosophy called epistemology that deals with these kinds of questions, and there's very, very many different definitions of knowledge. A classic one that's used dates back to Plato. There are real problems with it. It's not one I subscribe to, but it's very commonly used. You'll hear it a lot. Knowledge is justified true belief. That is, knowledge is a type of belief which happens to be true and for which you have some justification that it is true. So if you have a belief and it is true and it is justified, that amounts to knowledge. Those are the sort of the three ingredients that amount to knowledge. Now, of course, a lot has to be said about it. Well, what exactly does it mean for something to be true? What does it mean, especially for something to be justified? So there's all kinds of accounts, separate accounts for those terms. And then faith, well, there's a lot of different ways of conceiving of faith. I mean, faith, in ordinary conversation, the word faith amounts to something like a kind of trust, and whether that trust is sort of misplaced or not depends on whether or not you have evidence. So, of course, you can have a justified or warranted trust or an unwarranted trust. Sometimes faith amounts to little more than just a hope. I trust that the bus will arrive on time, and you know that that trust is not warranted because the bus seldom arrives on time, let's say. But you show up at the bus stop at the appointed time. That's an article of faith that the bus is going to arrive on time and be there to pick you up and not arrive early and leave without you. So, I mean, faith is just a kind of belief. We normally think of it as a kind of belief that's not particularly well justified. But I mean, it doesn't have to be entirely unjustified. And we have a word, a qualifier, blind, when we want to say that the faith is completely unjustified. We say blind faith, right? Sometimes we speak of a leap of faith, where the person just accepts a proposition or a belief knowing that they don't have a good reason. They might have a strong motive, for instance, but not a good reason. So I hope that, Helen, answers the question. It's sure to give rise to a lot more questions, because these are complicated epistemological concerns.
They are, and I'd like to come back to the difference between atheist and agnostic for a moment, because that's a pretty hot topic among atheists and among agnostics. Agnostics don't like to be called atheists in a lot of cases, and
ask yourself why.
Yeah, I understand that because atheism's, by yourself included, a lot of atheists consider atheism to be the position that there are no gods or there is no God. And I am not of that position, but I still consider myself to be an atheist, because there are some gods that I do consider to not exist. Right? I say that does not exist, that can't exist. I can say that about some gods, but not all possible concepts of the word God. So how does that fit with one definition of atheism being you believe there is no God, and the other being unconvinced that God claims are true? There has to be some sort of a meeting place between those two. When you're talking about all of these different God claims, you can't just say, in my opinion, you can't rationally say no gods exist of any kind. That to me would presume that you could understand every possible meaning of the word God. That's not necessarily a claim of absolute knowledge. It's just a claim of being able to rule out things that you don't have access to. Does that make sense?
Well, yeah. But when you say, if I say, look, I'm an atheist, and they go, really? Like what? You think there's no, you can't, you've got absolute proof that there's no God? No, I don't have absolute proof that every God on offer can't exist. I don't have, that's not my reason is that there's just no good reasons for thinking that there's a God, any kind of God. And now you might say, well, wait, any kind of God? Just a lot of kinds of gods on the table. Well, look, all I can tell you whenever I use any word is that I have taken into account every conception of God I've ever heard of. I have heard Bigfoot described very many ways, and I have heard Bigfoot described as a race of sort of hairy creatures that are from another world. I have heard Bigfoot described as a race of giant hairy creatures that are natural. They're our ancestors. They're kind of a weird vestigial offshoot of the human species that just sort of went along its own evolutionary pathway. I've heard of Bigfoot described as a kind of supernatural being, a kind of spirit. There's all kinds of ways of talking about Bigfoot. And look, when I say there's no Bigfoot, I mean all the ones I've ever heard of. Obviously, when I say there's no God, I can't be talking about the ones I haven't heard of. But
Right.
that's like saying there are no flying cars. Look, if I say there's no flying cars, it's because I've never heard of a car that actually flies.
There's
Okay?
another dimension to this that we haven't brought up yet, and it's that when you are dealing with a monotheist who has a very rigid idea of what God means to them, and that is the only possible God as far as they're concerned. If you say, no, that God doesn't exist, then as far as they're concerned, you're making an absolute claim of absolute knowledge. And since they don't believe in any other gods except their own, then you are potentially taking a much stronger stand than you actually are in their perception. And when you're having that dialogue with them, if you have rejected utterly the only God that they believe exists, and not only the only God, but the only understanding, the only map of that God, say a Jesus that where a version of Christianity that considers hell as just being separation from God. They don't ascribe to the pit of agony burning in a lake of fire, but they do believe that hell exists. I mean, there's so many different variations. That's just an example. But if you tell them no, that does not exist, then as far as they're concerned, you're taking a much stronger stand than you would if you talk to somebody like Bob Graves or Dr. Jones, who has a much more nuanced, more thoughtful version of the Christian God. And I would still tell them that I believe that God does not exist. But I couldn't say the same thing to a pantheist, depending on how they defined it, a deist, depending on how they defined it. I would say, I'm not convinced on those gods, right? But I would tell a Christian that I believe your God does not exist. So
Yeah, well,
that to me makes me an atheist, but also an agnostic, right?
yeah, well, I mean, it's perfectly fine to speak of agnostic atheism. That's what I am. I'm an
That's
atheist.
exactly.
Yeah,
Good. I'm
I'm an
glad that
atheist.
we came to that agreement then. That's
Yeah,
good.
yeah, no, I'm an agnostic atheist. I mean, I'm someone who thinks that there's no God, and it's because I don't think there's any good reason to believe in any God that's ever been suggested. But so when I say there's no God, I'm not saying I can rule out this God absolutely or that God. There's no God I can rule out absolutely, except gods that are like absolutely self-contradictory. And most people are smart enough. Well, I mean, certainly every theologian is smart enough to kind of rule out that kind of God, just about. But nothing hinges on the degree of conviction. I mean, I think it's a mistake to go around saying all gods are impossible. Well, you really have to sort of assume an awful lot about what can exist in a question-begging way to make that argument fly. You have like if one were to say something like there is and can only be the physical world, and therefore, since gods are supernatural and non-physical, gods cannot exist. Well, okay, well that's fine. But now all you've done is you've sort of defined gods out of existence because you've defined existence in a certain way that
Right.
excludes God. Well, that's fine, but that like nobody in their right mind should be impressed with that argument. It's a terrible argument because it's completely question making. I can define anything out of existence that way. And then when you show it to me, I'll say, no, that's something else. It's not. It doesn't actually exist. It can't exist. I mean, Zeus could materialize in front of these people, and they would say, no, that's not God. Yahweh could materialize in front of them, and those people would if they wanted to still stick with their definition, could still stick with their definition. Oh no, Yahweh here is, he's reconstructing the universe before my very eyes. He's creating another universe before my eyes, but he's a natural phenomenon. Like, okay, if that's your idea of a natural phenomenon, you've got an idea of natural phenomenon that squares perfectly with everybody's conception of supernatural.
The
So
great
now
thing,
you go ahead.
the great thing about cosmology right now is that there are so many unknowns with string theory, multiverse theory, rainbow gravity theory, all of these concepts that are leading us in the direction of asking more questions than we've already answered. For everything that we do answer, there seems to be more. So I think that's very exciting. It's very it's very stimulating mentally because it forces you to um, basically come to a decision as an atheist that you accept or do not accept naturalism as a fact. You and in that way, I think that since atheism and naturalism are so closely tied together, that is going to be a very important dialogue in the future. Since we can't necessarily rule out everything that naturalism means, there's no telling what it means,
That's right.
especially if there are 11 dimensions, for example. Who knows what those other dimensions actually entail? I mean, there's no way to there's so many unknowns that I don't think that it's actually rational to say that the natural world is all that exists when we don't even know what that natural world means. Like, so in that sort of coming at theism from that direction, I think that it's a powerful argument also to point out that since there is so much natural that we don't understand and we haven't learned yet, that what someone is taking for God, such as the fine-tuning argument, may have a natural explanation, but we can't justify that either. So I think that sorry, there is a long there's a lot that we still have to unpack, and all right, so it looks like we can make this show longer if you'd like. If you'd like to stay around,
Sure.
we
Yeah.
don't necessarily have to make it an hour. Um, so I wanted to ask you also to get back on track here. Were there any other topics related to what we were discussing on Skype this morning, or this earlier today, I should say, that we haven't addressed yet, or you feel we haven't properly fleshed out?
Yeah. Well, I'd like to say a little more about this whole sort of what I'm calling lack theism and stuff like that, because it's an argument that's got a lot of moving parts, and these moving parts in this argument, this definition of atheism as a lack of belief, as I say, the moving parts have to do with motivations, and I think the motivations are not good ones. And when people insist on this definition, it kind of hurts us as a movement. It hurts our credibility as skeptics. The problem, as I see it, is that, well, I think it just sounds stupid to say atheism is not a belief. And the reason I think is that when people say this, that atheism is not a belief, they're confusing I don't believe the proposition God exists with the proposition I don't have a belief about the existence of God. If you don't have a belief about the existence of God, then you're like a baby or you're like this, okay? But most atheists out there, I mean, Bionic Dance, for instance, and a lot of very sort of very well subscribed YouTube kind of celebrities who've been around for a long time. They go on an awful lot about atheism as a lack of belief, and this is what I think they're doing. They're confusing. I don't have a belief about the existence of God, lack theism, with I don't believe the proposition God exists. I'm sure if you ask someone like Bionic Dance or any of these people who subscribe to this view, whether they think God exists, they'll say, no, I don't think God exists. I mean, if they're honest, they'll say, I don't think God exists. Well, that is atheism. It's not mere lack theism. So the problem is this. When you say, I don't believe that God exists, okay, you are denying the proposition that God exists. You think God doesn't exist. That has a burden of evidence, but it's an easy one to discharge. But the other one, I don't have a belief about the existence of God, like a baby or this drinking glass, or okay, that has no burden of evidence, but it's not atheism at all. Okay, it's what one calls if what you call atheism is a state of no opinion on the matter, like a houseplant, then I think you need to stop calling yourself a skeptic. And I think what's happened here, getting to the issue of motive, is atheists have for so long been burden shifting, rather theists have been burden shifting on this question for so long that atheists have gotten hypersensitive about reminding them of the burden that theists have. We're constantly having to tell them, no, you've got to explain why you think there's a God, right? And a lot of theists want to say, no, you've got to prove that God doesn't exist, okay? And we're so weary and tired of reminding them of this huge burden that they have, is that some of us have gotten to the point where what we want to do is run away from what little burden of evidence that we have and define our atheism as something that has no burden. And we are comparing ourselves, describing ourselves in a way indistinguishable from inanimate objects that cannot even have an opinion. Newborn babies can't have an opinion on this question. Look, I don't lack an opinion on this question. I have an opinion on this question. And that comes with a burden of evidence. And another thing that's important to keep in mind here is when a person makes a claim and when a person interrogates a claim are two different things. If a person comes into the room and says, I think there's a God, or I believe there's a God, I can interrogate that person and just say, oh, why do you think that? I might even share their opinion, and I can still say, why do you think that? As soon as they've opened their mouth and said, I think there's a God, they have a burden of evidence. And it's okay for me to say, why do you think that? And it's illegitimate for them to insist that I have to prove that they're wrong first. That's just wrong, okay? Now, if I open my mouth and say, oh, well, I think there's no God. Well, now, we both have a burden of evidence. They have theirs and I have mine. That's just how it is. That everyone has a burden of evidence when they open their mouth, when they make assertions about reality. And I insist that atheism is an assertion about reality. And if it's not an assertion about reality, what are you saying? You're not saying anything about reality? You have no opinion on this question? Of course you do if you're an atheist.
The way that I would answer that, because I have argued from the position that you're arguing against in the past, and partially I do hold that, but it's such a complicated issue because there are so many different claims, so many different understandings of the discussion. I mean, a literal interpretation of the Bible or a deist. I mean, there's such a gulf there that to define exactly what you're saying you do or don't believe in, it would take forever or hours just to describe. But that being said, the way I look at it is that if you say something exists, such as Russell's teapot, you are adding something to reality. You're saying this is part of reality, and I'm making the claim that it is part of reality. Now, as an atheist, it sounds to me like what you're saying is that you are saying that is not part of reality. You're saying Russell's teapot does not exist. God does not exist. The claim that you're making is completely false. But it's only, and I'm agreeing with you here because you've sort of changed my mind, and I appreciate that, that all claims, all assertions about reality, whether a person admits it or not, have to be filtered through personal belief, my belief, your belief, the theist belief that's saying that this is part of reality. Whether or not they want to admit it, whether or not they realize it, they're only talking about their belief, their map, as you put it, of reality. They're not able to speak on what objectively does or does not exist outside of their own mind, whether or not they realize that. So if you are talking about what does and doesn't exist, saying God does not exist, then you are saying that your map of reality does not contain a God, that
Right,
there is no God in your map. You're not talking about objective reality.
Well, no, I am talking about objective reality.
Okay,
Yeah,
you're talking about the territory, or you're talking about your map of the territory?
No, your map is about the territory. So whenever you say X is the case, or I believe X is the case, those are the same thing. Those are exactly the same thing. So if you harken back to what we said at the beginning,
right.
If I say this is a glass, or I believe this is a glass, it's the same thing. it is literally the same thing. Now, sometimes in some contexts, we can use the word as a kind of the word belief as a kind of a hedge to say, well, I believe this is a glass. But usually when we say I believe something and we mean it sincerely, we are merely describing what we think is the case. So
Right.
when I say I believe this is a glass, I'm saying this is what I think is the case. And when I say just this is a glass, I'm merely saying this is what I think is the case.
I'm
Belief.
completely on board with that. I completely
Okay.
agree with you.
So when we're talking about reality, we are making our map. When you talk about reality, when you express your beliefs, that you are simply describing your map, but you're not talking about the map, right? You're drawing the map. That's the map, right? The map is
Well,
about the territory, right?
just to even invoke the word belief or knowledge or faith, you're still talking about your map, right? You're talking about the construct, the matrix in your mind, matrix in pre 1999 terms, the matrix in your mind of reality as you perceive it.
But I'm not referring to the things in my mind. When I say this is a glass and I believe this is a glass, I am trying to talk about the object in the world. I'm not trying to talk about my thought. If I wanted to talk about my thought, I'd say my thought is, and then I could say things about my thought. I could say, well, it's occasioned by neuron firings in my brain. It occurred from this time to that time. This thought is a little bit similar to a thought of something else. This thought, reminds me of another thought. My thought, I don't think has spatial dimensions and stuff like that. There are things I can say about my thought that are not true of the glass. I can say the glass has mass. My thought of the glass presumably does not have mass. My brain's got mass, but the thought of the glass doesn't have mass. But the glass has mass.
Okay.
There are things.
I think we're crossing over each other, but
Okay.
I understand. I understand what you're saying, and it's just a matter of phrasing, I think. But I think we're on the same page in
No, I
terms
think
of
we are.
what the map in your mind means. It's intellectual honesty demands that we admit that we cannot speak definitively about reality. We can only perceive it. We can only speak of our beliefs of it. And what I'm trying to say is anyone who makes a claim is talking about their beliefs of it. No matter how strongly they believe it, they're still
Well, they
talking
are
about
expressing their beliefs. They're
right, because no one
expressing their
has a
beliefs.
claim of absolute knowledge about the external world, right? They can make those claims, but you can't necessarily justify something is absolutely true based on your understanding of reality, right?
Oh, well, yeah, I think that all beliefs have to be provisional because every belief is subject to a pile of assumptions.
Right,
I
right.
mean, it has to be that my mind is working right. It has to be that I'm not dreaming, that I'm not tripping out on drugs, that my rational faculties are working, that my perceptual faculties are working, that my memory is serving me properly, and I'm actually meaning the words that I think I mean right now. And, like there's just an enormous number of things that I have to assume before I can get as far as even thinking this is a glass,
Right.
right? And so, and if that belief is going to turn out to be true, if it turns out that that belief is actually occasioned by the fact that there's a glass out there in reality, well, so much the better. But yeah, we're not disagreeing here on this point. We're sort of quibbling. The reason I'm quibbling with you here is just about when you say what we're talking about. No, when I'm talking about something, when I'm expressing my beliefs, I'm talking about reality. Who the hell knows if I'm succeeding in mapping reality correctly?
That's a great way to
When
put it.
you draw a map, you're trying to picture reality. Whether or not you picture reality correctly, it's another question. But the map is the expression of the reality that you're trying to get correct. And similarly, when I say X is the case, or I believe X is the case, these are merely my expressions, my efforts to properly represent reality. Who the hell knows if I am or not? There's no independent way of doing that except by appeal to other beliefs that we have. So it's not that we just live in our minds. That's not the claim. But it's important to be clear that when you say what we're talking about are our beliefs, I'm not talking about my beliefs. Right now, we happen to be talking about beliefs.
Right.
But
No,
normally, when you're talking about the
I
world, you're
understand.
talking about the world. Yeah.
Yeah, I get completely what you're saying, and I agree. And I think that it's very useful to point out for everyone who's listening that anytime you're talking to someone else about reality, you are talking about your concept of reality, The other person is talking about their concept of reality manifested in the claims, the assertions that you're making. You're still talking about your perception of reality. No one is making, no one is able to make omniscient sort of statements of this is in fact the way external reality is, and you cannot question that. All you can do is the limit of your perception as a fallible human being. You can't go past that. And that
Yeah.
is a powerful argument to make when someone starts beating you up with God exists and you know God exists, and that sort of arguments that a person can't, unless they actually do have divine knowledge, as they say, that God knows what you're thinking. Unless they actually do, then no matter how definitively they state their case about God, they're still only speaking of their beliefs. And it's an intellectually honest person that admits, as you're saying, and as I'm trying to say, that any claims we make are based on beliefs, and that's it. Because
Yeah.
that's crosstalk that happens a lot, I notice, is people think they have the capacity, especially when they don't have any real understanding of philosophy. They think they have the capacity to state definitively, this is the way reality is. And you can't. You can do your best. You can try to recreate an accurate map, but you're going to misplace a signpost, or you're going to not draw a road quite accurately on your map somewhere along the way, and you can make it as accurate as possible, but you can't make it perfect. And the best we can do is keep trying to refine that map and make it as accurate as possible, instead of just assuming, well, this is good enough. I can get from point A to point B. I don't have to work on it anymore. Right? Because I use
Yeah.
AutoCAD at work, and I think in these terms very well, that you end up creating something. I don't know if you're familiar with AutoCAD, but you end up
Yeah.
creating objects inside this space, and it's basically unlimited. You could make something as big as you could possibly imagine, or as small as you could possibly imagine. You could do whatever you want within that space, but you're still constrained by the space, by the program, just like our minds are constrained. So it's very important that people are aware of their limitations in that way.
This goes to the issue of certainty here, because really, when people are saying this is the case and they're being very definitive, really all they're doing is expressing their very high degree of conviction. And very often when people say that they know something, they will usually mean it in two senses. They will either mean it in the sense of, look, there is a consensus on this. There's a consensus on this, in that there's evidence that is sort of intersubjectively available to all of us, which if you were to simply look into it, you would see that this is an established fact. That, so we know it's the case. We know that, John F. Kennedy died from a bullet wound to the head, something like that. Now, but there's another sense in which people say they know, and sometimes it is merely to express their conviction, period, and they're not even bothering to appeal to intersubjectively available facts. They will say, I know because I have this, inner feeling, or God has communicated it directly to me, and stuff like that. And what's funny about that argument is, okay, look, let's just grant, for the sake of argument, that you're right, that the being that you think exists, or the theological claim that you happen to be making is correct, for the sake of argument. And let's imagine that the knowledge you have comes to you by an evidentiary pathway, that's unlike anything else. It's not like ordinary perception or memory or inference or anything like that, or observation. It comes by way of God just zapping knowledge into your head. Okay, well, unless you have some independent means of corroborating that knowledge is correct, the fact that you feel really confident about it, I don't know why you feel confident about it. Oh, well, it just comes prepackaged with confidence comes with the belief. It's just packaged in there. Oh, well, that's nice.
Can you repeat
that doesn't warrant any claim? Yeah.
The term that you use? Can you repeat that? Intersubjective. What did you say? Because I thought that was very good.
Oh, intersubjective availability. Well, when people talk about objective evidence, they say, well, it's an objective fact. You've got to be able to point to something objective. My belief is objective. What they mean is not just that there's a fact out there, but rather that the facts out there are equally accessible from any competent observer, anyone else who was equally competent, who had eyeballs in their heads, for instance, right, ears to hear, right, and hands to touch and stuff like that. They too could corroborate. They too could find out, right? The evidence is available intersubjectively. That is, I'm a subject. All evidence that I have comes by way of, my mind, and my senses mediated by my mind. Everything is happening in my mind. And when I want to corroborate something, I go to you, and well, all you've got is your mind and your senses and what's going on inside of you. And I can't see the thoughts in your head and the experiences that you're having. But we come to what is an intersubjective agreement. I hold up an object and I say, do you see this object? And I think to myself, it looks like this. And I say, what does it look like to you? And you say, oh, it looks like this to me. And I go, hey, how about that? It looks like that to me too. And next thing you know, we come to some agreement. This is, in fact, how we agree on things. And this is what we mean. This is what objectivity means, is merely intersubjective agreement. And it's not just a consensus. It isn't that I just talked you into agreeing with me. It's that quite independently of anything that I happen to say, you came to your own assessment by looking at the evidence here. And that's what we mean by objectivity. It's a kind of intersubjective agreement, but it's not just a consensus. It's not like, okay, we're all going to agree that when you play chess, white moves first. Okay, that's arbitrary. That's just something we decided and
debated. Convention. Yeah.
It's just a convention, exactly. Oh, when we're on the road in North America, we drive on the right, except to pass. We stick to the right lane. Now, but when it comes to sort of beliefs about the world around us, what we're interested in is evidence that is intersubjectively available, equally accessible to any competent observer. That's sort of the mark of objectivity. And now, let's imagine, though, a situation where a person has evidence that is not intersubjectively available. Okay, well, let me give you an example where that already exists, where we all know that this happens. If I'm hurt, if I get, stabbed or cut and I feel a pain in my arm, I'm aware of my pain in a way that you can't be aware of my pain. And you're aware of your pain in a way that I can't be aware of your pain. When I'm hurting, you look at me and I'm going, ow, and you can see a wound and all this. You are inferring that I'm in pain on the basis of my pain behavior. I am not inferring from my pain behavior that I'm in pain. I just feel the pain, period. It's right. Direct, immediate. I don't have to go, oh, geez, how about that? I must be in pain. Look at me. I must be in pain. No, all of these things are expressions of my pain, presumably. So that is a form of experience that is direct and immediate and subjective. You are never going to feel my pain the way I feel my pain. You're just going to always have to infer my pain from my pain behavior. Nevertheless, you are a being with similarly constituted physically who can also feel pain and has felt pain and knows under what kinds of circumstances pains are felt. And so you're able to recognize, oh, okay, when he behaves that way, it's like when I behave that way. And by a kind of analogy, your analogical reasoning, you're able to recognize that we're in pain. And so we all trust that we're in pain. This is how we know that other people dream. I had this weird experience while I was asleep. Oh, yeah, you too? We're all able to communicate meaningfully about experiences that nobody else is experiencing, but they experience experiences just like them, but not the very same things. We do in fact have experiences that are private and that no one else can experience. Okay, but we know that the reason I know that you can see colors and feel pains is because I can see colors and feel pains. These are facts that are intersubjectively available, even though I can't see the color blue in your head. I don't know that blue looks like the blue in your head looks like the blue in my head. For all I know, I see blue a little bit differently than you, or maybe completely differently than you. There's no way to sort of test that out right now.
The only way to find out that they are different is through communication.
That's right. But
yeah.
we try to put it to a test, and now let's imagine a slightly different situation now, where a theist comes along and says, I have an experience of God, and so I know that there's a God, and I'm certain there's a God, and I can't be wrong that there's a God. And I know this on the basis of an experience that was communicated to me, and it's come by a different epistemic pathway, a different evidentiary pathway, and it's kind of like a pain. It's not available to you, but it's available to me. It is logically private. It is necessarily private. I can't show it to you. And it might even be incommunicable. It's so unlike anything else that I can't even by means of analogy properly characterize it. Well, that's not incoherent. That could be. I don't think it's true, but it could be. And certainly a lot of people of a lot of different faiths believe exactly that.
Well,
All right.
let's turn this towards something away, turn it away from like pain, and let's talk about what is called in our culture true love, love at first sight, that sort of thing. If you've never felt that before, if you've never been in love to that degree or in that way, you've always had more of a cynical or physical conception of it. How it felt to you. Someone who has been in true love in their life, what they consider to be true love, that incredibly overpowering sensation of it, even if it was just for a few moments when they were 5 years old and they kissed their first girl. Most everyone knows what passion feels like, but true love, love at first sight, or as they say in the Godfather, the thunderbolt, that sort of a set of feelings and the mindset that you're in when that happens, and you find someone that can just completely destroy you by looking at you. Not everyone is going to be able to relate to that, and some people might be skeptical that that sort of mindset even exists. So
Yeah.
that I think it's a very good example when it comes to love, to show how our emotions can end up sort of irrationally changing our understanding of reality when we don't have any control over it necessarily. If you fall in love with someone, a lot of times there's very little you have to do with that. It just happens on your own. You can't stop thinking about them. You can't stop looking at them when you're around them, like that. And I think for especially Christians, and I'm sure it's the same for other religions as well, but to them, their understanding of God, this knowledge, would be the same love that you would feel for a person, except for more of a concept, like a very strong nostalgia, right? You feel very strong nostalgia about a Beatles album you heard when you were 16 years old, something like this. It's so strong that when you're 85, you still have the same feeling of nostalgia. That sort of mindset, I think, is where religious faith comes from. And as far as I'm concerned, that is entirely neurological, but you can't relate to it. You can't understand it in this sort of intersubjective availability that you're talking about from one person to the next.
Well,
Would
I
you
think
agree
it
with
is
that?
No, I don't. I think it is intersubjectively available. It's just, I mean, think about love songs. When I was growing up, I used to listen to all these love songs, and I could certainly, having had many romantic crushes and infatuations and things like that, um, and never felt any sort of deeper or substantive kind of love. I could relate to some love songs very readily. Sort of the boy has a crush and is pining on a girl kind of song. And then there were other love songs that just seemed a little bit kind of mushy and embarrassing, and I couldn't relate to them at all. And when I did relate to them, it was a real stretch of the imagination. And then, well, lo and behold, I fell in love, and I've been in love, madly in love, for 27 years. And the kind of love that I feel now is, I mean, I would easily lay down my life for my wife. I mean, and there was a time when I thought, geez, could you really just lay down your life for someone you love? I mean, could you really do it? I mean, well, maybe in a moment of passion, but think it through and decide, yeah, I'm going to do that. Yeah, I mean, there comes a point where you can experience a kind of love that is unbelievably selfless. And I think parents have this kind of thing for their children. I think having children is one of these things where everything in your neurophysiology changes. At the neural level, things change dramatically. You're kind of brain damaged. Your priorities change so that you fall below the welfare of your own children. You become less of a priority to yourself than your children are to you. So, I mean, love
Unless,
is
of course, God told you to kill your children, then you're more important, apparently.
well, barring cases like that. But anyway, the point is that these facts, although not all of us are in a position at every stage in our lives to experience them, at some point in our lives, many of us, or if not most of us, are in a position to experience these things. So, like when you're 9 years old, the idea of like romantic love and courting a girl and stuff like that is maybe a little bit embarrassing when you're a 9-year-old boy, but by the time you're 16, boy, you can really feel that you're there, you're on board. And but as you get a little older, certain other kinds of love, it's more selfless kinds of love, less passionate loves that are more altruistic in character. You can identify with those. So there are all kinds of experiences that you can have that you don't have now, and while you're not having them, it's very hard to understand them. And the closest you can come to them is by way of analogy. Well, I kind of feel something like this. It's like, I don't know, if you've ever had wisdom tooth problems, and you've ever talked what it's like to have sore wisdom teeth, and what that feels like to someone who's never had wisdom tooth problems. And, like, well, what is that like? Well, you describe the pain of having a wisdom tooth, and it's like, well, where does it hurt? Well, I can't even tell if it's upper or lower. That's how weird it is,
Right.
And they go, really? I've had tooth pain. I've had like a cavity, and I can always tell with acute precision where the pain is. But very often with wisdom tooth pain, the pain is referred so drastically sometimes. It's happening up here, but you're feeling it down here, or you can't even tell where it is. You can't localize it. But by way of analogy with similar experiences that people have, relevantly similar experiences, you can achieve some degree of intersubjective agreement. Now, to get back to the example of the religious person where we started with this, a religious person in principle could have, it's not impossible that a person could have a kind of experience that's like pain or like love that's very hard to communicate to someone who hasn't already experienced it. And they'll say, when I have this experience, and because I've had this experience, I know that X exists, or God exists, or Jesus exists, or the Holy Spirit exists, or whatever, and I'm certain with it. Okay. The problem with this is that unless that is something that is intersubjectively available to other people, they have no reason to believe it. And but you also have to ask yourself, why does this persuade even the person in question? When we're talking about love and pain, you're talking about a feeling.
I
There's
think
no question.
I could answer that from the devil's advocate position of
Sure.
Christian. The argument when I bring up points like that to believers, the argument usually runs along the lines of every culture throughout human history has had some sort of spiritual belief, whether it was animism or polytheism or whatever. But they all had this feeling that there was something greater than themselves. So in that way, that would be their explanation for this intersubjective availability you're talking about, how everyone does have this shared experience. Not necessarily individuals may not, but humanity itself has this intersubjective availability of spiritual experiences. So that's how they, in their mind, can justify saying that it's a properly basic belief, to use Plantinga's term. I'm such a noob at philosophy. He may not even be the one that invented that idea, but you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, he didn't. But he uses it a lot, and he uses it in
Right.
connection exactly the way you say. So,
But that's, to them, they think that it's justified, and I can't help but come back to this point that as you grow up and you learn about the world around you, you're going to hit these walls of questions that you can't answer. You might have someone giving you a good explanation for these questions. You might not. You might be convinced by the explanations they give you. You might not. So I don't think that it's, and I was going to ask you also, because we should, I'm going to try to draw this at a close at 90 minutes, but would you explain, to unpack, if you will, the concept for the audience in lay terms of what a properly basic belief is when it's applied by theists to belief in God?
oh, well, that's a little complicated because different people will different theologians will do it differently. Like Alvin Plantinga, whom you mentioned, is a philosopher. He's a contemporary analytic philosopher. He's retired now. He's an emeritus professor, and he's also a Calvinist, a part of the Reformed Protestant tradition, and he believes in something called properly basic beliefs. Now, properly basic beliefs are beliefs that are They are basic. They are at the foundation. They are at the base of the rest of your web of belief. They're at the core of the web, or the base of the edifice or the structure of your beliefs. Everything sort of rests on these kinds of beliefs. Like a belief in logic. We all believe in logic. We all trust our memories. We all trust our senses. We know that they're not foolproof, but the point is we trust them from day to day. We trust in induction. There's all kinds of things. We believe in a mind-independent reality. These kinds of things, we believe that other people have minds. We don't think there's zombies out there. We think that, like us, they have minds, even though we can't experience their experiences directly. We just infer that they have experiences and such, and we don't assume that they're just elaborate machines. So,
but
what's that?
Solipsists, some solipsists would. But.
Yeah. I've actually never met a solipsist, but I don't
Anyway,
think.
Sorry to interrupt.
No, it's okay. So, properly basic beliefs are these beliefs that are sort of at the very base, the foundation of the rest of your belief set. Everything in your belief set rests on those. And someone like Alvin Plantinga believes that one of these properly basic beliefs, and he thinks that, now, he and I would disagree on this. I think properly basic beliefs have to be universal. They have to be universally held. They have to be universally shared. We have to all believe them. If you can, if some people can have them, some people can't, then I think, in my view, they're not properly basic. They are disposable. Obviously, some people do dispose of them. But he would not agree. He would say, no. Belief in God is properly basic. That is, it's foundational to a worldview. It is an ingredient in the worldview that makes it the worldview that it is. So, a big difference between someone like me and Plantinga, or between me and any Christian, for instance, is that they believe in a God, that he is all good, all powerful, all knowing, and he's a person with a mind and a will, and he created the universe. He has a plan for us, and all of this, and that he's moral, and that morality issues from this being. Now, this is a belief which, if it is in your belief set, permeates the rest of your beliefs. I mean, it's going to influence what you think life and death are, what the significance of life and death is, what is the significance of how you act and what you do, and why you do what you do. It affects, when you look at a sunset, what you see. I see a sunset, I see something beautiful. But when somebody else who's a theist looks at a sunset, they don't just see a sunset that's beautiful the way I see it's beautiful. In addition, they see it in a way that I might look at a painting. They see it as a created artifact, right? They see it as a beautiful creation, and so there is something in their belief set that makes the whole rest of their experience different from my experience. When they will see certain things as tragic that I might not see as tragic. I will see things as tragic that they don't see as tragic. When somebody dies, for me, they're dead, they're gone forever, it's over. For them, that's a little less tragic in a way, because they're not really dead. They're not ultimately dead. They're going to persist in some other form. This world is really the beginning of the story. In my view, this is the end of the story when you die, for that person. So it's properly basic on Plantinga's view, because a belief in God, that is properly basic on his view, because it infuses everything else in your belief set with a different significance than it would have if that belief were not there. I don't think that's right. I don't think that is necessary, because I think really almost anything in your belief set can have that effect. If you're a Randian objectivist, there are certain propositions that you might believe that would affect the whole rest of your belief set and your value structure and such. These things can come and go. People can just change their mind about these things. People go from not believing in God to believing in God. Some people go from believing in God to not. So, but I hope that makes sense of what he thinks is a properly basic belief.
Yeah, and especially considering what we've been discussing about any claims that are made are really just a matter. They have to be filtered through. That this is a belief someone has made, that they have, that they're very confident about it. They're very sure that it's true, but it's still, since they're just a human being and you're just a human being, they're still just talking about what they believe to be true, no matter how strongly they assert it. And stating, see, that the problem then comes when we start trying to use rationality to find out whose belief makes more sense than the other. Because if someone does have these beliefs, whether or not they're properly basic, that are so central to their understanding of reality that they can't not believe them, then we have to decide, is it, I mean, is it reasonable? Is it fair to use rationality, to use logic and reason to objectively try to strip down this belief of theirs, even though they can't exist. Their map can't exist without that. That I
Yeah,
think is
yeah.
where we have to be very careful in our discussions with theists. I don't want to cut you short, but we need to
No,
end in
no
about a
problem.
minute. So if you have any final thoughts that you wanted to give, feel free. And thank you very much for talking with me today on my first show.
Oh, thank you. Okay, well, if we're going to just sum up, I'll probably sort of uh, sum up with what we were talking about at the outset about sort of the definition of atheism. It seems to me that if we define um, atheism as a mere lack of belief, um, what it really the only reason to do that is to try to evacuate um, agnosticism as a category and subsume it under atheism. The other motivation is to try to define ourselves as having a default position, which, for no good reason, um, needs no defense and has no burden of evidence. And I think that's false. Um, and we end up likening ourselves to what I would call lacktheism. Uh, Inanimate objects that lack a belief in God, or babies and stuff like that. And this doesn't convince anybody. It doesn't persuade people on the other side. All that we do when we do that is sort of discredit ourselves, because it sounds as if we will not be bothered to defend what we think is the case. So I would just, people who are inclined to this view, I would ask them, what are you? Are you a lacktheist or are you an atheist? That is, do you merely lack a belief that there's a God in the same way that a houseplant lacks a belief in God? Or do you lack a belief in a God because you have an opinion on the matter, and that your opinion is that there isn't a God? That's not, you don't have to sort of, that's not an allegation that you're certain of anything. You don't have to prove that gods don't exist. You just have to give reasons why you think it's irrational. It's no different than believing or not believing in Bigfoot. So I think that atheism is an opinion. It is an opinion on the existence of God. It is an assertion about reality. And as such, it has a burden of evidence. It's not a burden of evidence that's particularly difficult to discharge. And I don't think that we should therefore adopt a definition of atheism that characterizes us in such a way that it looks to everybody else as if we're fleeing from the little burden of evidence that we have, while at the same time demanding that they live up to theirs. I think we discredit ourselves when we do this. I think it's a big mistake. I think it's factually incorrect to describe ourselves that way, and it looks insincere, and it makes us look like we don't have the courage of our convictions when we say, I don't think there's a God.
I think I completely agree with that. And I think that a lot of times it has to do with people being afraid of overextending themselves by making claims, and then falling
Yeah,
back to the position that they think, oh, well, since I haven't made any claims, I've only criticized other people's beliefs, then I don't have any burden of proof myself.
yeah,
I
yeah.
think
Well,
that's a very common position.
as long as you're only criticizing another person's position, that's fine. But as soon as you open your mouth and say what your position is, you've got a burden of evidence, even if it's a negative claim. Remember, positive and negative claims, they turn into one another. Just stick a not in front of a positive claim and it's a negative claim. Stick another not and it's a positive claim again. Like, it's just an artifact of our language, what turns out to be a positive or negative claim, right? It's simply not true that negative claims don't have a burden of evidence. They certainly do. Just go and tell somebody that the moon landings didn't happen. Is that a positive or a negative claim? Well, it depends how
Exactly.
you want to look at it.
Yeah.
Anything can be construed as a positive or negative claim, just depending on how you phrase it,
Yeah.
right? Is
That's a
theism
great
a positive claim, or is atheism the positive claim and theism the negation of atheism? It doesn't matter how we came up with these ideas originally in history, at what stage of life we come up with them. An assertion about reality is an assertion about reality. Just stick up to your burden of evidence. And in the case of atheism, I don't think that's hard a burden to discharge.
No, I would agree with that completely. And again, thank you very much. It's been a great discussion.
Thank you very much. It's a real privilege to be the first guest on your show.
Yeah,
I wish you all the success.
thank you.